The universe is a very peculiar thing, isn't it? One moment you are minding your own business, wondering if a Jaffa cake is technically a biscuit or a cake is a cake, the VAT tribunal said so, which is the sort of profound wisdom I live for. And the next, your entire destiny is shifted by a man named Mr. Henderson and a laminated seating chart. I've always believed that life is like a bowl of porridge. If you don't stir it, it gets lumpy. But if you stir it too much, it goes all gooey and loses its soul. My soul was feeling particularly hungry that Tuesday morning at St. Jude's Academy. I was sitting at the back of the classroom, happily contemplating the philosophical implications of my leaky bureau, when the Great Migration was announced. Right, year 12, Mr. Henderson barked, his voice sounding like a gravel path being trodden on by heavy boots. I'm sick of the chatter, new seating plan, alphabetical order was a mistake, we're going by temperamental balancing now. Temperamental balancing. That sounded like something you'd do to a car engine or a very grumpy cat. In reality, it meant Mr. Henderson was pairing the daydreamers with the doers. And because the universe has a very dry sense of humor, Daisy Miller, a girl whose primary skill is identifying cloud shapes that look like famous cricketers, was paired with Alistair Thorne. Alistair Thorne, even his name sounds like a cold breeze hitting a window pane. Alistair was the school's resident XBA, as my cousin back in London might say, though here we just called him the human calculator, or the boy who never blinked. He was tall, pale, and had a fringe so sharp it could probably slice cheddar. He sat in the front row with his back straighter than a ruler, surrounded by an invisible aura of "don't you dare breathe near my fountain pen." Daisy, Mr. Henderson pointed a meaty finger at the empty desk next to Alistair. "You're with Thorne. Perhaps some of his discipline will rub off on you, and perhaps some of your, whatever it is you do, will stop him from looking like he's perpetually smelling a bad egg." I gathered my belongings, 3 notebooks, one for actual schoolwork, 2 for doodles of penguins in hats, a handful of glitter pens, and a half-eaten packet of polos, and shuffled toward the front. The silence that greeted me at Alistair's desk was the sort of silence you find in a library right before someone sneezes. It was heavy, it was professional, it was terrifying. "Hello," I whispered, sliding into the seat. "I'm Daisy. I like your protractor. It's very circular." Alistair didn't look up. He was busy aligning his pencil case with the edge of the desk. He moved it 3 millimeters to the left, then 2 millimeters back to the right. "It is a standard issue geometry tool, Miller," he said. His voice was like a cello played by someone who was currently very annoyed with the music. "Please refrain from placing your belongings over the invisible line dividing our workspace." I looked down. There was no line, the invisible line. "Precisely," he said, finally glancing at me. His eyes were a very dark, very serious grey. "I require order to function. You, based on the fact that you have a sticker of a toasted marshmallow on your blazer, clearly do not." "It's a Stay Toasty sticker," I chirped, feeling a surge of my usual, slightly misplaced optimism. "It's a metaphor for life, Alistair. We're all just marshmallows being toasted by the fire of existence. Some of us get golden brown. And some of us catch fire and turn into charred lumps of goo. But the goo is the best part." Alistair blinked. Just once. It was a slow, deliberate blink of someone who had just encountered a very strange species of bird. "I am here to achieve 3 stars and a place at Oxford, Miller. I am not here to be a toasted marshmallow. Please open your textbook to page 42. Thus began the Great Cold War of Desk for B. For the first week, we existed in a state of mutual bewilderment. Alistair was a machine. He took notes in for different colours of ink. He never doodled. He never looked out of the window at the squirrels. I, on the other hand, found it physically impossible not to share my thoughts. "Alistair," I whispered during a particularly dull lecture on the corn laws. "Do you think if ghosts were real, they'd get annoyed by draughty houses, Like, would they think, oh brilliant, another cold breeze, that's just my luck. He didn't even turn his head. The corn laws, Daisy, focus on the tariffs. But the ghosts, Alistair, it's a matter of spectral comfort. He let out a sigh that seemed to come from his very marrow. Ghosts are a metaphysical impossibility. Tariffs, however, are an economic reality. One will get you into university. The other will get you a psychiatric evaluation. I pouted, but I wasn't deterred. You see, I have a theory about cold people. They aren't actually cold. They're just like those posh fridges that have a hidden button to make ice cubes. You just have to find the button. The incident happened on a rainy Thursday. It was the sort of rain that makes everything in England look like it's been filmed through a grey sock. We were in the middle of a chemistry practical, which is always a recipe for disaster when I'm involved. Mr. Henderson had trusted us with copper sulfate, a beautiful, vibrant blue liquid. It looked like liquefied summer. Alistair was, of course, the lead scientist. I was the equipment manager, which meant my job was to hand him things and try not to knock anything over. Hand me the stirring rod, Miller, carefully, Alistair commanded, his goggles making him look like a very stern deep-sea diver. You know, I said, reaching for the rod, this blue is exactly the same colour as the eyes of that cat that hangs around the chippy. I call him Sir Barnaby. He's very dignified. But he once tried to eat a napkin. Miller, the rod, Alistair repeated, his hand outstretched. I grabbed the rod, but my sleeve a slightly oversized cardigan I'd bought at a charity shop because it had vintage charm and a small hole in the elbow, hooked onto the edge of the beaker. Time slowed down. It was like one of those nature documentaries where a gazelle realizes it's made a terrible mistake. The beaker tipped. The blue liquid, the liquefied summer, didn't just spill, it leapt. It performed a graceful, sapphire arc through the air, heading straight for Alistair's pristine, handwritten, colour-coded revision notes for the upcoming mock exams. No, I shrieked, my hand flying out to catch it. I didn't catch the liquid, I caught the beaker, but only after it had emptied half its contents onto Alistair's folders. And then, because my luck is a cruel mistress, I tripped over my own feet, sending my other hand, which was holding a half-open bottle of distilled water, soaring. Splash. Alistair stood there. He didn't move. He didn't scream. He just watched as his life's work turned into a soggy, indigo swamp. The corn laws were now the blue laws. The periodic table was now a periodic puddle. The entire lab went silent. Mr. Henderson stopped talking about catalysts. Even the Bunsen burners seemed to hiss in sympathy. I stammered, my heart doing a frantic tap dance against my ribs. Alistair, I am so sorry. I'll dry them. I'll rewrite them. I'll learn calligraphy. I'll buy you a new life. I grabbed a handful of brown paper towels, the kind that are about as absorbent as a brick, and started frantically dabbing at his desk. I was probably making it worse. I was definitely making it worse. I was smearing the blue ink into a giant, messy bruise across the paper. Stop, Alistair said. His voice wasn't loud. It was quiet. Very, very quiet. That's the dangerous kind of quiet. I froze, a soggy paper towel in my hand. Alistair. He looked down at his notes. He looked at the blue stain on his white shirt. Then he looked at me. I expected fire. I expected a lecture on the structural integrity of folders and the incompetence of daydreamers. I expected to be banished to the back of the room forever. Instead, Alistair Thorne did something I had never seen him do. He twitched. His shoulder shook. A small, strange sound escaped his throat. It sounded like a rusty hinge. He was laughing. It wasn't a normal laugh. It was the laugh of someone who had spent 18 years being perfect and had finally reached the point where the absurdity of the universe had broken him. It's blue, he choked out, pointing at his notes. It's all incredibly blue. I'm so sorry, I wailed, though I was starting to feel a bit hysterical too. I've turned your future into a smurf. Sir Barnaby, Alistair gasped, leaning against the lab bench. You said it was the colour of a cat's eyes. It is. Sir Barnaby is very blue. He started laughing harder, his goggles slipping down his nose. I spent, for hours, on those diagrams, for hours of my life, and now they look like a contemporary art piece titled Melancholy in a Chemistry Lab. I couldn't help it. A giggle bubbled up in me, followed by a full-blown snort. It's very avant-garde, Alistair. Very bold. The examiners will be impressed by your commitment to the colour palette. We stood there in the middle of the lab, surrounded by blue chaos, laughing like absolute loons. Mr. Henderson approached us, looking confused. Thorne, Miller, what on earth is going on? Alistair wiped his eyes, his face flushed a real, human pink. The equipment manager had a minor malfunction, sir, but on the bright side, I've decided that the corn laws are much more interesting when viewed through a sapphire filter. Mr. Henderson looked at the mess, then at us, and shook his head. Clean it up. Both of you and Thorne. Get a new shirt. We spent the next hour scrubbing the desk. It turns out copper sulfate is remarkably stubborn, much like Alistair himself. As we worked, the silence between us changed. It wasn't the heavy, professional silence from before. It was a shared, tired, slightly blue-tinted peace. I have a spare set of notes at home, Alistair said quietly, his voice back to its cello-like tone. But softer now, I digitize everything. I like the feel of paper. It feels more real. See, I cried, pointing a soapy finger at him. You're a secret romantic. You like the feel of things. That's very philosophical of you, Alistair. Marcus Aurelius would be proud. He actually smiled. A real, proper smile that reached his eyes. It was like seeing the sun come out after a long winter in Yorkshire. I highly doubt the Roman Emperor cared much for GCSE revision folders, Miller. Oh, I bet he did. He probably had a very tidy scroll case. But I bet he spilled wine on it at least once. It's what makes us human. The spills, the messes, the blue stains on our fingers. I looked at my hands. They were stained a pale, ghostly azure. Alistair looked at his own hands. They were the same. Maybe, he said, but tomorrow you are staying at least 6 inches away from the beakers. Fair point, I conceded, but I'm still bringing the stay toasty stickers. From that day on, the invisible line disappeared. It wasn't that Alistair stopped being an overachiever. He still studied like his life depended on it, but he started leaving a little space for the messiness. Sometimes, when I was staring out of the window, he'd nudge me and ask, "What does that cloud look like, Miller?" And I'd say, that's clearly a teapot with a bit of an identity crisis. And he'd nod, very seriously, and say, "I see it, though mathematically, it's more of an obtuse triangle." We became the unlikeliest of friends. The boy who knew everything and the girl who knew nothing about maths, but everything about how to cheer up a sad digestive biscuit. One afternoon, a few weeks before the final exams, I found a small, neatly wrapped square on my desk. I opened it to find a brand new fountain pen. It was a beautiful, deep indigo colour. Attached to it was a tiny note in Alistair's perfect, precise handwriting. For the equipment manager, in case of further philosophical emergencies, note, the ink is permanent. Please use with caution. I looked over at him. He was already buried in his further maths textbook, his face as serious as ever. But I noticed something. On the corner of his very expensive, very professional leather bag, there was a small, slightly crooked sticker. It was a toasted marshmallow. My heart did a little somersault. I realized then that life isn't just about the stars or the perfect notes. It's about the people who sit next to you in the rain. It's about the shared laughter in the middle of a disaster. It's about the fact that no matter how hard you try to be a calculator, eventually, someone is going to spill blue ink all over your life, and it might just be the best thing that ever happens to you. I picked up the pen and started to write. I didn't write about the corn laws or the tariffs. I wrote about the way the light hits the floor of the library at 4 o'clock, and how the world is a very big, very strange, very beautiful place. And Alistair Thorne, without looking up from his equations, reached over and moved my pencil case to millimeters to the left. "Order, Miller," he whispered. "Chaos, Thorne," I replied. He huffed a small, amused breath. "Fine, a compromise," ordered Chaos. "I can live with that," I said, sticking a polo in my mouth, "as long as there are biscuits." "I brought shortbread," he muttered, still focused on his work. "In my bag. Don't tell anyone. It'll ruin my reputation." I grinned, looking out at the grey Oakhaven sky. The rain was falling again, but for the first time in my life, I didn't mind the grey. Because I knew that underneath the clouds, everything was secretly, wonderfully blue. Sometimes the universe doesn't give you what you want. It gives you a desk mate who thinks you're a nutter, a stain that won't come out, and a reason to smile when everything goes wrong. And honestly, that's more than enough for me. I leaned back, watched a bird land on the windowsill, and thought about the philosophy of the shortbread. It's crumbly, yes, it's buttery, certainly, but most importantly, it's better when shared. And that, I decided, was the most profound thing I'd learned all year. Alistair nudged my arm. Page 84. Daisy, the Industrial Revolution won't learn itself. I'm on it, Alistair, I'm on it. I opened my book, the blue pen gripped tight in my blue-stained hand, and for once I didn't even mind the history. I was exactly where I was supposed to be, right in the middle of the mess, sitting next to the boy who finally learned how to blink. The Monday morning after the Great Ink Incident arrived with a sky the colour of a bruised plum. It was the sort of English weather that made you want to crawl back under your duvet with a mug of tea and stay there until the sun decided to make a guest appearance sometime in July. I arrived at Oakhaven Academy exactly 4 minutes late, my hair a frizzy testament to the humidity and my school tie slightly lopsided. As I skidded into the classroom, the radiator was clanking a rhythmic, metallic tune. Alistair was already there, of course. He looked as though he had been ironed into existence. His pens were lined up in order of ink volume, and his notebook was open to a page so white it hurt my eyes. I slumped into my seat, my back hitting the floor with a heavy thud that made several people jump. Alistair didn't jump. He merely adjusted his glasses with his middle finger, a very precise, very Alistair gesture, and nudged a small, rectangular object toward me. It was a wet wipe. "Good morning to you too, Thorne," I whispered, taking the wipe. "Is this a subtle hint that I look like I've been dragged through a hedge backwards?" "It's not subtle, Miller," he replied, his gaze fixed on the whiteboard. "You have a smudge of marmalade on your chin, left side, approximately 3 millimeters from the corner of your mouth." I rubbed my face vigorously. "It's apricot jam. Actually, philosophy of the breakfast table. Alistair, if you don't wear a bit of your meal. Did you even really eat it? It's about commitment. It's about showing the world that you and the toast have become one." He sighed, but it wasn't the cold, dismissive sigh of the previous month. It was a weary, almost fond sort of exhale. "The toast and you are an unholy union. Now, please, open your textbook to page 92. We're starting the Corn Laws." "The Corn Laws sound like something a very boring squirrel would invent," I muttered, but I did as I was told. As the lesson droned on, I found my mind wandering, as it usually did, toward the more important things in life, like why the staples in my book always seemed to point towards the window, or why the ink in my new blue pen felt so much heavier than the ink in my old black one. I looked at Alistair. He was taking notes in a shorthand so elegant it looked like elvish script. He was a machine, a beautiful, high-functioning, slightly terrifying machine. But then I looked down at his shoes, underneath the desk, tucked away from public view. His left shoelace was tied in a double knot, but the right one was a triple knot. A tiny, microscopic inconsistency. I felt a surge of triumph. "You're lopsided," I whispered, leaning closer. He didn't move his head. I beg your pardon. Your laces, one is a double, one is a triple, your equilibrium is off. Thorne, the universe is tilting to the right because of your footwear. Alistair paused. He actually stopped writing. He looked down at his feet, his brow furrowing in genuine distress. He stayed like that for a good 10 seconds, staring at his shoes as if they had betrayed his very soul. I was in a rush, he murmured, his voice sounding uncharacteristically small. My mother forgot to pick up the dry cleaning, and I had to find a spare shirt, and then the cat. You have a cat, I practically squealed. Mr. Henderson, the history teacher, glared at me over his spectacles. I lowered my voice to a frantic hiss. You have a cat. What's its name? Is it as serious as you? Does it do its own taxes? Alistair looked pained. His name is Barnaby. He is a ginger tabby. And he is remarkably unintelligent. He spent 20 minutes this morning trying to catch a beam of light that was reflecting off my watch. Barnaby, I breathed. That is the best thing I have ever heard. Barnaby the light chaser. See, even your cat knows that sometimes you have to pursue the impossible, even if it's just a shiny bit of nothing on the wall. He ended up running into a radiator, Alistair said dryly. That's just part of the process. Every great thinker has run into a radiator at some point. It's a metaphor for the boundaries of human knowledge. Alistair looked at me, and for the first time, he didn't look away immediately. You have a very strange way of looking at the world, Daisy Miller. Everything is a metaphor, or a philosophy, or a biscuit-related epiphany. It makes the grey days brighter, I said, reaching into my bag and pulling out a small, crumpled sticker. It was a cartoon broccoli wearing sunglasses. I peeled it off and, before he could protest, slapped it onto the side of his silver calculator. There, to remind you that even the most boring things can be cool if they try hard enough. Alistair stared at the broccoli. He looked like he wanted to peel it off. His fingers even twitched toward it. But then he stopped. He looked at the sticker, then at me, then back at the sticker. Broccoli, he said flatly. With sunglasses, I reminded him. Right, naturally. He didn't take it off. He left it there, a tiny green rebel on a sea of grey plastic. The rest of the week was a blur of revision and rain. Oak Haven was a school that lived and breathed exam results. The hallways were lined with posters of success pyramids and 10 steps to top marks. It felt like a pressure cooker, and I was the slightly overcooked potato at the bottom of the pot. Alistair, however, was the steam valve, or at least, he tried to be, but I noticed that the circles under his eyes were getting darker. He was staying in the library until 7 every night, fueled by nothing but black coffee and sheer willpower. On Thursday, I found him slumped over a table in the back corner of the library, his head resting on a volume of economic history of the British Isles. He wasn't asleep, but he was close. His glasses were pushed up onto his forehead, and he looked human, not like the Ice King. Just like a tired boy who was trying too hard to be perfect. I sat down opposite him and didn't say a word. I just started unpacking my emergency joy kit. Out came a thermos of lukewarm hot chocolate, a packet of Jaffa Cakes, and a very small, very squishy stress balls shaped like ducks. Alistair lifted his head. He looked at the Jaffa Cakes with a mixture of longing and suspicion. We aren't allowed food in the library. Miller, Mrs. Higgins will have our heads on pikes. Mrs. Higgins is currently in the staff room, arguing with the kettle, I said, pushing the packet toward him. And anyway, Jaffa Cakes are technically fruit. They have orange in the middle. It's practically a salad. He let out a short, sharp bark of laughter. It was a wonderful sound, like a rusty gate finally swinging open. He took a Jaffa Cake, nibbled the chocolate off the top first, a very logical way to eat it, and then sighed. I have to get Anna in this module, he said, his voice low. If I don't, my father, he won't be angry. He'll just be disappointed, which is significantly worse. The silent disappointment, a classic parental move. I said, nodding sagely. My parents are the opposite if I get a C. They throw a party because they were worried I'd accidentally set the exam paper on fire. But I get it. The pressure to be a diamond is exhausting. Sometimes it's okay to just be coal. Coal is useful. It keeps people warm. Diamonds just sit there and look expensive. Alistair looked at the Jaffa cake in his hand. I don't know how to be coal, Daisy. I've been trained to be a diamond since I was 5. I knew my times tables up to 12 before I could ride a bike. Well, that's your problem right there, I said, handing him a duckstress ball. You missed out on the vital falling off a bike stage of development. Falling is important. It teaches you that the ground isn't actually that scary. It's just the ground. It's always there too. Catch you. He squeezed the duck. It made a tiny, pathetic squeak. Alistair blinked. He squeezed it again. Squeak. This is ridiculous, he muttered, but his grip on the duck didn't loosen. It's a philosophical duck, Alistair. It represents the fragility of the ego. Also, it's yellow, which is the colour of optimism and custard. We sat there for an hour, not studying, just talking. He told me about his father's law firm and the silent dinners where they discussed the 100. I told him about my 3 sisters, who all played the recorder at the same time, and how our house smelled like burnt toast and damp dog. Your life sounds loud, he said, a hint of envy in his voice. It's a riot, I agreed, but it's a good riot. You should come over sometime. We can have a recorder concert. You can be the triangle player. It's the most mathematical instrument. Alistair smiled. A real, genuine smile that reached his eyes. I think I'd like that. As we left the library, the rain had stopped, leaving the pavement glistening under the amber glow of the street lights. We walked toward the bus stop in a comfortable silence. The air smelled of wet earth and distant wood smoke. Alistair, I said as my bus pulled up. Yes, Miller. Don't study tonight. Go home, feed Barnaby, and watch something stupid on telly. The Corn Laws will still be there tomorrow. They've been dead for 150 years. They aren't going anywhere. He looked at me, his hand resting on the strap of his perfectly organized bag. I'll consider it. The broccoli is watching you, I shouted as I hopped onto the bus. I watched him from the window as the bus pulled away. He was standing there, a solitary figure under the lamplight. He looked down at his bag, reached out, and straightened the Stay Toasty sticker on the corner. Then he did something I never thought I'd see. He pulled the duckstress ball out of his pocket, looked at it for a second, and gave it one last, defiant squeeze. I leaned my head against the cold glass of the bus window and smiled. Life is a strange thing. We spend so much time trying to draw straight lines, trying to make sure everything fits into a neat little box with a ribbon on top. We worry about the ink stains and the lopsided laces and the grades that define us. But the truth is, the most beautiful things are the ones that are slightly broken, the things that don't fit, the friendships that bloom in the middle of a spilled bottle of azure ink. The next morning, the sun actually decided to show up. It wasn't a big, dramatic sun, just a pale, watery English sun that peeked through the clouds like it was apologizing for the previous week. I walked into the classroom and found a small, sticky note on my desk. It wasn't in Alistair's usual perfect script. It was a bit rushed, a bit messy. Daisy, I watched a documentary about penguins last night. Did you know that when a penguin finds its mate, they give them a pebble? It is a very inefficient system of courtship, but remarkably effective. I thought you might appreciate the lack of logic. Also, I have informed Barnaby about the radiator metaphor. He was unimpressed, but he did stop chasing the light for 5 minutes to eat a piece of ham. P.S. I am currently on page 112. Try to keep up. I looked over at him. He was already working, his pen flying across the page, but there, right next to his hand, was a small, smooth pebble he must have picked up from the school driveway. I picked up the pebble. It was cold and grey and perfectly ordinary, but to me it was better than any diamond. It was a sign that the Ice King was melting, one Jaffa cake and one philosophical duck at a time. I put the pebble in my pocket, opened my book, and started to read about the Industrial Revolution. And for the first time, the words didn't just feel like facts, they felt like a story. A big, messy, beautiful story that we were all a part of. Thorne, I whispered. Yes, Miller. Do you think penguins ever get worried about their grades? He didn't even pause his writing. Mathematically speaking, it's unlikely. They are far too busy being functionally adorable. Functionally adorable, I repeated, tasting the words. I like that. I think that's my new life goal. You've already achieved it, Daisy, he murmured, so softly I almost didn't hear him. Now, please, page 112. The steam engine awaits. I felt a warmth in my chest that had nothing to do with the radiator. I turned the page, the blue ink on my fingers a badge of honor, and dived into the chaos of the past, sitting right next to my very own, very serious, very wonderful penguin. The classroom hummed with the sound of 30 students breathing, the scratch of pens, and the distant chime of the church clock. It was just a normal Tuesday in Oak Haven. But as I looked at the little broccoli sticker on Alistair's calculator, I knew that nothing would ever be quite the same again. We were ordered chaos. We were a double naught and a triple naught. We were a blue stain on a white page. And honestly, it was the most perfect thing I'd ever seen. I reached into my bag, found a spare polo, and slid it onto Alistair's desk. He didn't look up, but his hand reached out, took the mint, and popped it into his mouth. A small victory, a tiny, minty bridge between two worlds. I settled into my chair, the sun warming the back of my neck, and thought about the philosophy of the pebble. It doesn't have to be a diamond to be precious. It just has to be given by someone who finally learned how to see the light, even when it's reflecting off a radiator. The lesson continued, the teacher's voice a low murmur in the background, but my mind was already off on another adventure, wondering if Barnaby the cat would like a sticker of his own, maybe a fish. A fish with a top hat, yes, that seemed appropriate. I smiled to myself, picked up my pen, and began to write, not about the steam engine, but about the boy next to me, and how sometimes the best lessons aren't the ones you find in books. They're the ones you find when you're brave enough to get a little bit of ink on your hands. Alistair's elbow brushed mine just a tiny, accidental contact, and he didn't pull away. He just kept writing, his rhythm steady and sure. And in that small, shared space, I realized that maybe, just maybe, the world wasn't quite as scary as I thought. As long as you had a friend, a duck, and a packet of shortbread hidden in a bag, you could face anything, even the corn laws. I took a deep breath, the scent of old paper and peppermint filling my lungs, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't looking for the exit. I was exactly where I wanted to be. Right here, in the mess, in the light, with the boy who knew the value of a well-placed pebble. The bell rang, signaling the end of the period, but neither of us moved immediately. We lingered for a second, caught in the quiet gravity of our shared desk. "See you at lunch, Thorne?" I asked, packing my things with my usual lack of coordination. Alistair stood up, his posture perfect, his bag slung over his shoulder. He looked at me, and there was a glint of something bright and mischievous in his eyes. "Only if you promise not to bring any more vegetables with I wear, Miller." "I make no such promises," I grinned. He shook his head, a small smile playing on his lips, and walked out of the classroom. I watched him go, noticing that he was walking a little differently today, a little lighter. A little less like a machine, and a little more like a boy who had a ginger cat named Barnaby waiting for him at home. I followed him out, my heart feeling like it had been blown up like a balloon, light and airy and ready to float away. The corridor was crowded and noisy, but I didn't mind the crush. I just touched the pebble in my pocket and felt the cool, solid reality of it. The universe is a big, strange place, full of entropy and equations and unexpected blue stains, but every now and then, if you're very lucky, it gives you exactly what you need, even if you didn't know you were looking for it. I headed toward the canteen, my mind already buzzing with ideas for Barnaby's top hat fish sticker, because life is too short for plain cats and far too long for perfect notes. And as the rain started to patter against the windows again, I didn't even reach for my umbrella. I just turned my face toward the grey sky and laughed, because I knew, deep down, that the sun was still there. It was just waiting for its cue, and in the meantime, I had plenty of stickers to go around. The canteen at Oakhaven High was a cavernous hall of echoes, smelling perpetually of damp wool coats and the aggressive scent of industrial-strength vinegar. It was the sort of place where social hierarchies were carved into the very plastic of the orange chairs. You had the footballers in the centre, loud and expansive like gas filling a vacuum, the theatre kids near the stage, always 3 decibels to high, and then there was the quiet periphery. The realm of the thinkers, the dreamers, and those who simply wanted to eat their ham sandwiches in peace. I stood at the threshold, my tray clattering slightly in my hands. I'd opted for the chef special, which appeared to be a beige square of mystery topped with a slightly more golden brown rectangle of hope. It was a brave choice. A choice made by a girl who had a pebble in her pocket and a duck-related secret in her heart. Scanning the room, I spotted Alistair Thorne. He was exactly where I expected him to be, at a small table by the window, as far away from the radiator's hiss as possible. He was reading a book that looked suspiciously like it contained no pictures at all. His lunch was laid out with the precision of a surgical tray and apple, a small pot of yogurt, and a sandwich wrapped in greaseproof paper with folds so crisp they could probably cut glass. I navigated the minefield of stray bags and outstretched legs, feeling a bit like a ship tossing in a gale. My shoelace, having decided that its brief period of employment was over, had come undone again. I ignored it. If I tripped and fell, I'd just pretend it was a very avant-garde interpretive dance about the fall of the Roman Empire. Is this seat taken, or is it reserved for the ghosts of mathematicians past? I asked, sliding into the chair opposite him before he could answer. Alistair looked up, his gaze steady. He didn't look annoyed, which in Alistair speak was basically a standing ovation. The ghosts prefer the library, better acoustics for sighing. I grinned, setting my tray down. Good, because I have a very important delivery. I reached into the side pocket of my bag, the one that usually smelled of forgotten orange peel, and pulled out a small, hand-drawn sticker. It was a fish. A very round, very smug-looking fish wearing a tiny, precarious top hat and carrying a miniature cane. I'd used my best gel pens for it, the ones that shimmered like a puddle on a sunny day. I slid it across the table. It came to rest exactly 2 centimeters from his yogurt pot. Alistair stared at it. For a long moment, he didn't move. I started to wonder if perhaps I'd crossed a line. Maybe top-hatted fish were a taboo subject in the Thorne household. Maybe he was more of a monocle-wearing crustacean person. For Barnaby, I explained, my voice suddenly a little smaller, in case he wants to go to a gala or a very formal pond. Alistair picked up the sticker. He held it by the edges, inspecting the tiny, glittering scales I'd painstakingly drawn. A small, almost imperceptible huff of a laugh escaped his nose. It was the most beautiful sound I'd heard all day, better than the bell at the end of double maths. Barnaby, he said softly, is a cat of simple tastes, but he does enjoy a bit of theatre. See, I knew it, I said, attacking my beige square with renewed vigour. He looks like a cat who appreciates the finer things, like fancy fish and high-quality sunbeams. We ate in a comfortable sort of silence. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of two people with nothing to say. It was the soft, woolly silence of two people who were quite all right with not saying anything at all. I watched the rain smear the window pane, thinking about how life is a bit like a canteen lunch. Sometimes you get the chocolate sponge with custard, and sometimes you get the mystery beige square. But as long as you have someone to share the table with, the beige square tastes a little bit more like a feast. Miller, Alistair said, breaking the quiet. He was looking at his sandwich, his expression thoughtful. Why do you do it? Do what? Eat mystery squares. It's for the thrill of the unknown. Alistair, I live on the edge. No, he said, looking up, his grey eyes searching mine. The stickers, the pebbles, the chaos. You spend so much energy trying to make things less orderly. I chewed slowly, thinking about the philosophy of the mess. I don't think I try to make them less orderly. I think the world is already a mess, Alistair. It's a giant spinning wall of entropy and spilled tea. Most people spend their whole lives trying to build fences around their little patch of dirt to keep the mess out. They want everything in boxes, but the boxes always break, and when they do, people get sad because they don't know how to handle the spill. I leaned forward, my elbows resting on the table. I just think, if you embrace the spill from the start, you don't have to be afraid when the boxes break. A blue stain isn't a mistake, it's a new part of the map. It's just life happening. Alistair looked back at his perfectly folded greaseproof paper. I like my boxes, Miller. They're safe. They make sense. If I follow the rules, the outcome is predictable. If the outcome is predictable, I can't fail. But if you never fail, I whispered, you never find out that failing isn't the end of the world. It's just the beginning of a different story, one where you might have to wear a top hat to a gala you weren't invited to. He didn't answer, but he didn't look away either. For a second, the canteen felt very small, as if the walls had tucked themselves in around us. Then, the moment was shattered by a loud thud. A few tables over, a group of Year 10s were engaged in what looked like a high-stakes competition involving a plastic bottle and a lot of misplaced enthusiasm. The bottle had flown off their table and landed squarely in a bowl of tomato soup belonging to a very surprised-looking prefect. Splatter, red, vibrant, and completely unavoidable. The prefect sat there, stunned, as soup dripped from his tie. The Year 10s went silent, their faces pale. The entire canteen held its breath, waiting for the explosion. I looked at Alistair. He was watching the scene with wide eyes, his hand instinctively reaching for his own napkins, as if he could somehow intervene from across the room. See, I murmured, the box broke. The prefect didn't shout. He didn't stand up and demand a detention. Instead, he looked down at his shirt, looked at the shaking Year 10s, and then slowly he started to laugh. It was a wheezing, surprised sound. He picked up a chip, dipped it into the soup on his sleeve, and ate it. The tension broke like a snapped string. The canteen erupted into noise again, a mix of laughter and relieved chatter. Alistair turned back to me, a strange expression on his face. He's eating his sleeve. He's adapting, I corrected. He's making the soup a choice rather than an accident. It's very brave, really, a culinary revolution. Alistair looked at the top-hatted fish sticker still in his hand. Then, with a deliberate, steady movement, he peeled the backing off. I held my breath. He didn't put it on his notebook. He didn't put it on his bag. He stuck it right in the center of his pristine, white yogurt pot lid. There, he said, his voice firm, now it's a formal yogurt. I felt a surge of warmth in my chest that had absolutely nothing to do with the chef special. It was the feeling of a door creaking open, just a fraction. It was the feeling of a world where maybe, just maybe, the boy who loved equations could find a bit of magic in a shimmering fish. As the bell rang for the afternoon session, we stood up together. I tripped over my shoelace almost immediately, stumbling into a stack of trays. Alistair reached out, catching my arm with a grip that was surprisingly strong. "Steady, Miller," he said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "We can't have you collapsing before English. We're doing Keats. It requires a certain amount of structural integrity." "Keats is all about the soul, Alistair," I said, regaining my balance and giving him a mock-serious look. "The soul doesn't need structural integrity. It just needs a good pair of wings and a snack." "And a top hat?" he asked, walking beside me as we joined the flow of students in the corridor. "Especially a top hat," I agreed. "It's very difficult to be profound without proper headgear." We walked through the halls of Oakhaven to very different shapes in the same grey sea. I felt light, as if the gravity of the school rules had lost its hold on me. I thought about the pebble in my pocket, the blue stain on my notebook, and the boy who was currently carrying a formal yogurt through the science wing. Life was messy, it was loud, and it was unpredictable, and sometimes it smelled like vinegar. But as I looked at the back of Alistair's head, I realized that the mess was where all the good things lived. The laughter, the stickers, the unexpected friendships that sprout like daisies through the cracks in the pavement. I didn't know what would happen in English. I didn't know if I'd ever get my shoelaces to stay tied for more than 10 minutes, but as we reached the classroom door, Alistair paused. He held the door open for me, a small, traditional gesture that felt like a grand ceremony. "After you, Miller," he said. "Thank you, Thorne," I replied, stepping inside. And as I sat down at our shared desk, I noticed something. There, tucked into the corner of the wooden surface, was a tiny, perfect circle of blue ink that hadn't been there before. Alistair saw me looking. He didn't say anything, but he didn't try to rub it away. He just opened his textbook and began to read, his elbow resting just a hair's breadth away from mine. I smiled, picked up my pen, and began to draw a tiny pair of wings on the margin of my page, because the sun was still waiting for its cue. But in the meantime, we had plenty of light right here. The afternoon sun began to filter through the high, arched windows of the English block, casting long, golden rectangles across the dusty floor. It was the kind of light that made everything look like a memory before it had even happened. Our teacher, Mrs. Higgins, was a woman who lived and breathed iambic pentameter, her voice rising and falling like the tide as she spoke of Ode to a Nightingale. I tried to focus, I really did, but the philosophy of the pebble was still rattling around in my brain. I looked at Alistair. He was taking notes, his handwriting a marvel of consistency. Every T was crossed with a ruler straight line, every I dotted with a precise, clinical point. He looked like a man who knew exactly where his soul was kept, probably in a small, velvet-lined box in his top drawer, filed under S. I, on the other hand, felt like my soul was currently wandering the corridors, looking for a biscuit. "The weariness, the fever, and the fret," Mrs. Higgins intoned, her glasses sliding down her nose, "here, where men sit and hear each other groan." I leaned over to Alistair, whispering under the cover of a particularly loud cough from the back row. "Do you think Keats liked biscuits? He seems like a man who would appreciate a nice digestive, something sturdy for all that groaning." Alistair didn't look up, but his pen paused for a fraction of a second. He was a romantic poet, Miller. They lived on air, melancholy, and the occasional tuberculosis. Biscuits would have been too structurally sound for them. "That's their mistake," I whispered back, scribbling a small digestive biscuit with a sad face in my margin. "Melancholy is much easier to handle with a bit of wholemeal crunch. It's a scientific fact." "I doubt that," he murmured, "though I suppose the sugar might help with the fever." I felt a bubble of giggle rising in my throat. This was the magic of the Ban King Ban, the secret language of the desk. In the middle of a serious lesson about the transience of life and the beauty of death, we were debating the dietary habits of 19th century poets. It was a tiny, private world, a bubble of us in a room full of them. I looked at the blue stain on the desk again. It looked a bit like a map of a tiny island. I imagined Alistair and me living there. He'd be in charge of the maps and the clocks, ensuring the tides came in on time. I'd be in charge of naming the clouds and teaching the local crabs how to dance the foxtrot. We'd probably argue about the best way to build a hut. He'd want load-bearing beams, and I'd want a roof made of peacock feathers, but we'd have a very good time regardless. Miss Miller. I jumped, my pen skidding across the page and giving the sad digestive biscuit a very long, accidental tail. Mrs. Higgins was looking at me, her eyebrows raised. Would you care to share your thoughts on the bird's symbolic role in the third stanza, or is your digestive friend more pressing? The class snickered. I felt my face turn the color of a very ripe strawberry. Oh, the bird. Right. I think the nightingale is like a sticker, Mrs. Higgins. The silence that followed was so thick you could have wear upon a jumper with it. Alistair put his head in his hand, his shoulders shaking slightly. A sticker, Miss Miller, Mrs. Higgins asked, her voice dangerously calm. Yes, I said, leaning into the chaos. Because it's something small and beautiful that you find in a messy world. It doesn't belong to the mess, but it sits on top of it, reminding you that there's something shiny. It's a bit of a mortal bird in a world of leaden-eyed despairs. You can't peel the song away, even when the world gets grey. Mrs. Higgins stared at me for a long time. I braced myself for a lecture on the sanctity of literature. Instead, she slowly pushed her glasses back up her nose. An unorthodox comparison, she said softly. But not entirely without merit. The nightingale is a permanent fixture on a temporary world. Very well, carry on, Miss Miller, and do try to keep your biscuits to a minimum. I sat back down, my heart hammering against my ribs. I looked at Alistair. He was looking at me, and for the first time, the smile wasn't just in his eyes, it was on his face. A real, genuine Alistair Thorne smile. A sticker, Miller, he whispered. Really? It worked, didn't it? I grinned, feeling like I'd just climbed a mountain. I'm a literary genius. I should probably get a cape. Get the cape, he said, turning back to his notes, but try not to trip over it. The rest of the lesson passed in a blur of golden light and Keats. When the bell finally rang, I felt a strange sense of reluctance. For the first time, I didn't want to leave the classroom. I didn't want the bus bubble to pop. As we packed our bags, the atmosphere was different. The awkwardness that had defined our first few days was gone, replaced by a comfortable, quiet understanding. We were like two gears that had finally found their teeth, one shiny and new, the other a bit rusty and covered in glitter, but turning together nonetheless. Are you going to the library? I asked as we walked out into the corridor. Alistair hesitated. Usually, the library was his sanctuary, the place where the boxes were most secure, but he looked at the rain outside, then back at me. Actually, he said, I think I've had enough of quiet spaces for one day. I have to go to the pet shop to buy some specific kibble for Barnaby, apparently. He's developed a preference for the salmon-shaped ones. Can I come? I blurted out. I mean, I'm an expert on salmon-shaped things, and I want to see if they have any top hats for hamsters. Alistair looked at me, and there was that glint again, that bright, mischievous spark that made him look like a completely different person. I suspect you're going to be a terrible influence on my cat, Miller. The best influences always are, I said, hopping over a discarded crisp packet. We walked out of the school gates together, the cool afternoon air hitting our faces. The world was still grey, the clouds were still heavy, and my shoelace was still undone. But as I walked beside the boy who liked equations, I realized that I didn't need the sun to come out. I had a pebble, I had a fish sticker, and I had a friend who knew that sometimes the most important thing you can do is eat your sleeve and keep on laughing. Race you to the bus stop, I challenged, already halfway into a sprint. Miller, you're wearing school shoes and carrying a bag full of glitter, he called out, but I could hear the sound of his footsteps quickening behind me. Exactly, I shouted back, the wind whipping my hair across my face. That's what makes it a challenge. We ran through the streets of Oakhaven, to flashes of grey and navy against the damp pavement. I didn't care about the mud on my skirt or the fact that I was probably going to miss the bus anyway. All I cared about was the feeling of the air in my lungs and the knowledge that the box was broken and it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. Because life isn't about the perfect notes or the straight lines. It's about the blue stains, the top-hatted fish, and the people who are brave enough to stand in the rain with you, waiting for the sun to find its cue. And as we reached the bus stop, panting and laughing, I knew that this was just the beginning. The pebble was just the first stone in a bridge we were building, one sticker at a time. I looked at Alistair, his hair slightly ruffled by the wind, a single blue ink smudge on his cheek that he hadn't noticed. "You've got a bit of chaos on your face," I said, reaching out to point it out. He didn't flinch, he just smiled. "I know, Miller, I think I'll keep it." The bus journey was an exercise in vibrating silence, not the heavy, suffocating silence of a library before an exam, but a humming, expectant sort of quiet. I sat on the damp velour seat, my knees bouncing at a frequency that probably could have powered a small village, while Alistair sat beside me. His long legs folded neatly like a piece of expensive origami. He was looking out of the window, his reflection ghostly against the backdrop of the passing terraced houses and the occasional sodden chip shop. "You know," I said, unable to keep the thoughts inside my head for more than 30 seconds, "I've always wondered if buses have feelings. Like, do they get tired of the same route? Do they wish they could just veer off and go to the seaside for a cheeky 99 flake?" Alistair didn't look away from the window, but I saw the corner of his mouth twitch. "They are inanimate objects, Miller. They lack a central nervous system, let alone a desire for soft-serve ice cream." "That's exactly what a bus would want you to think," I whispered conspiratorially. "They're playing the long game. Stoicism is a very effective camouflage. You should know." He finally turned to me, his eyes dark and unreadable, yet somehow softer than they had been that morning. "Are you comparing me to a double-decker bus now? First a nightingale, then a bus. Your metaphorical range is eclectic." "It's a gift," I said, patting my satchel, which was currently leaking a small trail of glitter onto the floor. "Most people are just one thing. You're a complex onion of a person, Alistair, layers. Some make you cry, some are great in a stir-fry, and some just exist to be mysterious and papery." "I'm not sure I want to be in a stir-fry," he remarked, but there was no bite in it. We hopped off at a stop near a row of shops that looked like they hadn't been updated since the mid-90s. The air smelled of rain and frying onions. Paws, claws, and whiskers was tucked between a dry cleaner and a shop that sold exclusively beige wool. As we pushed the door open, a bell tinkled a cheerful, slightly frantic sound that matched my heartbeat. The shop was a labyrinth of birdseed bags and chew toys. It smelled intensely of cedar shavings and something vaguely fishy. Alistair navigated the aisles with the precision of a man on a mission, bypassing the colourful rubber chickens and the squeaky hedgehogs. He stopped in front of a shelf stacked with premium cat food. "Here," he said, reaching for a bag that featured a very posh-looking Persian cat wearing what looked like a diamond collar. "The salmon-shaped kibble. Barnaby refuses the star-shaped ones. He finds them structurally unsound, I suspect." "He sounds like a critic," I said, crouching down to look at the bag. "Does he have a little velvet cushion and a monocle? I feel like he should have a monocle." "He has a cushion," Alistair admitted, his voice dropping an octave as if he were revealing a state secret. "It's navy blue. He doesn't have a monocle, though he does have a very judgmental way of blinking." I knew it like owner, like feline. I wandered off toward a glass counter at the back. "Alistair, look, the hats." He joined me, looking down at a display of tiny, festive accessories meant for small rodents. There, nestled between a miniature sombrero and a pink cowboy hat, was a tiny, felt-top hat with a red ribbon. "It's him," I breathed, pressing my nose against the glass. "It's the personification of elegance. Imagine a hamster in this. He'd look like he was about to go to the opera to see the Marriage of Figaro, but he'd have a cheekful of sunflower seeds." Alistair looked at the hat, then at me. His expression was one of profound bewilderment, the kind you might see on a scientist discovering a new, particularly confusing species of morph. "Why would a hamster go to the opera, Miller? They have no concept of Italian librettos." "It's not about the libretto, Alistair. It's about the vibe. It's about feeling fancy even when you're running in a plastic wheel that smells like cedar. It's a metaphor for life. We're all just hamsters in top hats, trying to look dignified while our lives spin in circles." I thought that was rather deep. I felt like I should write it down on a tea towel and sell it for £15. Alistair, however, just sighed, but it was a gentle sigh, the kind you give a puppy that's accidentally sat in its own water bowl. "How much is it?" he asked the lady behind the counter. "3.50, dear," she said, smiling over her spectacles. Alistair reached for his wallet, but I stopped him. "No, this is my contribution to the cause of hamster dignity. Even though I don't have a hamster, I'll keep it as a talisman, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is a hat for every situation." I paid for the hat with a handful of coins that I'd scavenged from the bottom of my bag, including a very sticky 20p piece that I had to peel off a stray gummy bear. As we left the shop, the top hat safely tucked into my pocket, the sun actually made a brief, flickering appearance through the clouds, like a shy guest at a party. "My house is just 10 minutes from here," Alistair said. Adjust the heavy bag of kibble under his arm. If you still want to meet the critic." "I wouldn't miss it for all the salmon-shaped kibble in the world," I said, trying to contain my excitement. I failed, obviously. I ended up doing a little skip-hop that nearly resulted in me tripping over a bollard. Alistair's house was exactly how I imagined it. It was a semi-detached Victorian villa with a neat garden and a front door painted a very serious shade of forest green. Inside, it smelled of old paper and beeswax. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt intentional, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath to avoid disturbing someone's thoughts. "Barnaby," Alistair called out softly, setting the kibble down in the kitchen. A large, fluffy ginger cat emerged from the shadows of the living room. He didn't run, he sauntered. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a king inspecting a new colony. He stopped a few feet away from us, sat down, and began to wash a single paw with utter indifference. "He's magnificent," I whispered, dropping to my knees. "He's like a sunset with legs." "He's a menace," Alistair said, though he immediately reached down to scratch the cat behind the ears. The transformation in Alistair was instant. The tension in his shoulders vanished. The genius Thorne shell didn't just crack, it dissolved. He looked young, just a boy with his cat. "Can I gestured toward the ginger majesty. "Be careful, he's a tough audience." I reached out slowly. Barnaby sniffed my fingers. I smelled like glitter, ink, and the cheap perfume I'd sprayed on myself this morning, which was supposed to smell like midnight jasmine, but mostly smelled like aggressive lemon. He seemed to find this acceptable. He leaned his heavy head into my palm and let out a purr that sounded like a distant outboard motor. "He likes you," Alistair said, sounding genuinely surprised. "He usually hides when people come over. My mother says he has social anxieties, but I think he's just a snob." "He's not a snob. He's just selective," I said, feeling an immense sense of pride. "He knows I'm a kindred spirit. We both understand the importance of a good nap and a specific biscuit shape." We sat on the kitchen floor, me with the cat, and Alistair leaning against the counter. The kitchen was clean and modern, but there were little signs of life everywhere. A stack of sheet music on the table, a bowl of apples that looked like they'd been there for a while, a photograph on the fridge of a younger Alistair holding a trophy, looking deeply uncomfortable. "Alistair," I said, looking up at him. "Yes, Miller. Why do you keep everything in boxes? You know, the metaphorical ones. You're so tidy, not just your bag, but your whole self. It must be exhausting, trying to keep the lines so straight all the time." He was silent for a long moment. He looked down at Barnaby, then back at me. "Lines are safe," he said finally. "If you stay within them, you know where you are. You know what's expected. If you start colouring outside them, things get messy, people get disappointed. You lose track of the equation. But the mess is where the fun is," I argued, accidentally ruffling Barnaby's for the wrong way. The cat gave me a look that suggested my execution was being scheduled for Tuesday. "If you never get messy, you never find out what you're made of. You're just a finished product. I'd much rather be a work in progress, a very confusing, glitter-covered work in progress." Alistair leaned his head back against the cupboard. "I think you're more than a work in progress, Miller. I think you're a force of nature, a slightly chaotic, biscuit-obsessed hurricane." "Is that a compliment? Because I'm taking it as one. I shall add hurricane to my CV, right next to expert in hamster millinery." I pulled the tiny top hat out of my pocket. "Do you think?" Alistair stared at the hat, then he looked at the cat. "He will kill us both in our sleep. It's a risk I'm willing to take." With bated breath, I leaned forward. Barnaby was currently distracted by a stray piece of kibble that had escaped the bag. Gently, with the precision of a diamond thief, I placed the tiny felt top hat between his ears. For 3 glorious seconds, Barnaby the cat was the most sophisticated creature in the United Kingdom. He looked like a Victorian gentleman who had just heard a particularly scandalous piece of gossip at the Gentleman's Club. Then, with a single, elegant flick of his head, the hat was sent flying across the kitchen floor. Barnaby stood up, stretched, and walked away with a look of supreme disdain. I burst out laughing. It started as a giggle and turned into a full-blown cackle that made my ribs ache, and then I heard it. Alistair was laughing too. It wasn't a polite, ha-ha laugh. It was a real, deep-chested chuckle that made his eyes crinkle and his whole face light up. It was the sound of a box finally being kicked open. The look on his face, Alistair gasped, pointing at the cat who was now grooming himself as if the indignity had never happened. "He looked like he was about to challenge you to a duel." "I'd lose," I wheezed. "He's got claws. I only have stationery." We sat there on the floor, laughing until our eyes leaked, the silence of the house completely shattered. In that moment, the distance between us, the gap between the girl who failed maths and the boy who understood the universe, seemed to vanish entirely. We were just 2 people in a kitchen, bonded by the absurdity of a cat in a hat. "You're okay, Thorne," I said, wiping my eyes with the back of my hand, probably smearing more ink in the process. "You're exhausting, Miller," he replied, but he was still smiling. But I suppose the library was getting a bit too quiet anyway. As I looked at him, I realized that maybe I wasn't just here to teach him about the beauty of a blue stain. Maybe he was teaching me something, too, about the quiet strength in being still. About the way a single person or a single cat can be an entire world if you just take the time to look. "Tea?" he asked, standing up and offering me a hand. "Does it come with biscuits?" I asked, taking his hand. His grip was firm and warm. "Naturally, I believe we have some custard creams, though I can't guarantee they're salmon-shaped." "I'll survive," I said, pulling myself up. "But I'm warning you, Alistair, now that I've seen the real you, I'm not letting you go back into the box. I'm going to be there every day." With a fresh supply of glitter and philosophical questions about the inner lives of buses. Alistair paused, the kettle in his hand. He looked at me for a long beat, and for once, he didn't look away. "I think," he said softly, "that I might actually look forward to that." And as the kettle began to whistle, a bright, cheerful sound that echoed through the house, I knew that the story wasn't just about a school assignment anymore. It was about something much bigger. It was about the way to different melodies, when played together, create a harmony that neither could have found alone. Even if one of those melodies is slightly out of tune and smells like lemon perfume. We spent the rest of the afternoon talking, not about Keats or equations, but about the things that actually matter. He told me about his father, who was always away on business, and the pressure of being the perfect son. I told him about my 3 older brothers who treated me like a football, and why I once tried to build a rocket ship out of cardboard boxes and old fireworks. It didn't end well. I realized that his coldness wasn't because he didn't feel anything. It was because he felt too much. The logic was a shield. The silence was a sanctuary. And I had just stomped in with my muddy boots and my top hats, making a mess of everything. And he didn't seem to mind at all. When it was finally time for me to go, Alistair walked me to the front door. The rain had stopped, leaving the world smelling fresh and clean. The street lights were flickering on, casting long, amber shadows across the pavement. "See you tomorrow, Miller," he said. "See you tomorrow, Thorne. Don't forget to tell Barnaby I'm sorry about the hat, but also tell him he looked dashing. I'll pass it on, though I suspect he's already planning his revenge." I turned to walk away, but then I stopped. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. It was the poem I'd started writing in the back of my notebook during our first study session, the one I'd been too embarrassed to show him. "Here," I said, shoving it into his hand. "It's not Keats, it's not even a good limerick, but it's for you." Before he could read it, I turned and ran toward the bus stop, my heart thumping a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could feel the weight of his gaze, a warm, steady presence at my back. On the bus home, I sat by the window and watched the world go by. I thought about the pebble in my pocket, the sticker on the desk, and the blue ink on Alistair's cheek. I realized that the most beautiful things in life aren't the ones that are perfect. They're the ones that are broken, smudged, and slightly ridiculous. They're the ones that make you laugh when you want to cry, and the ones that remind you that you're never truly alone, as long as you have a friend who's willing to wear a bit of your chaos. I reached into my pocket and felt the tiny felt top hat. I smiled. The box was gone, and in its place, there was a whole world of messy, beautiful possibilities. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. I didn't know if we'd pass our exams or if Barnaby would ever forgive me. But as the bus turned the corner, I felt a strange, wonderful sense of peace. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't just the girl who tripped over her own feet. I was the girl who had found the music in the silence. And I couldn't wait to see what happened in the next verse. The bus journey back to my neighborhood felt different that evening. Usually, the number 42 was a place of frantic last-minute revision or staring blankly at the rain-streaked windows while wondering if I'd left the immersion heater on. But tonight, the vibration of the engine felt like a purr, and the neon lights of the kebab shops and off-licenses blurred into a celebratory parade of amber and crimson. I sat with my knees pulled up, my fingers tracing the outline of the felt top hat in my pocket, and I thought about the sheer, terrifying brilliance of being alive. Life, I decided, was a bit like a digestive biscuit. Most people are obsessed with the chocolate coating the shiny bits, the successes, the moments where you look like you've actually got your life together. But the real substance is the crumbly, slightly plain bit underneath. It's messy, it falls apart if you soak it in tea for too long, and it leaves a bit of a mess on your jumper, but that's where the flavour is. Alistair Thorne was a digestive biscuit who had been pretending to be a high-end macaron for years, and I felt like the luckiest person in the world for having seen the crumbs. When I finally pushed open the front door of our house in Finchley, I was greeted by the usual symphony of chaos. My eldest brother, Leo was trying to fix a leaking pipe in the hallway while Max and Toby were arguing loudly over whose turn it was to use the good gaming controller. The smell of burnt toast and damp dog wafted from the kitchen. "You're late, Mouse," Leo shouted over the sound of clanging metal, using the nickname I'd hated since I was 6. Mum's left a casserole in the oven. "It looks like a science experiment gone wrong, so eat at your own risk." "I've had tea with a genius," I announced, stepping over a stray wrench. "I am far too sophisticated for your casserole concerns." "Did the genius teach you how to walk without tripping over the carpet?" Max yelled from the living room. "Because you just stepped on Toby's trainers." I looked down. I had, indeed, stepped on a very expensive-looking pair of Nikes. Usually, I would have apologized profusely or started a shouting match. Instead, I just smiled. It was a wide, beaming, slightly manic smile that made Leo stop his plumbing work and look at me with genuine concern. "You all right, Miller? You haven't joined a cult, have you? You've got that I've seen the light look about you." "Maybe I have," I whispered mysteriously, skipping up the stairs, the cult of the tiny hat. I spent the rest of the night in my room, staring at the ceiling. I thought about the poem I'd handed Alistair. It was a dreadful piece of literature, really. It didn't rhyme properly, the meter was all over the shop, and I'd used the word spherical to describe his eyes, which didn't even make sense, but it was honest. It was about how some people are like locked rooms, and how sometimes you don't need a key, you just need to knock until the person inside gets bored enough to let you in. I wondered if he was reading it now. I imagined him sitting in that vast, quiet library of his, the cat Barnaby purring at his feet, his long fingers smoothing out the crumpled paper. Would he laugh? Would he think I was a complete nutter, or would he see the little spark of truth hidden between the clumsy metaphors? The next morning, the sun decided to make a rare appearance. It was one of those crisp, British autumn mornings where the air tastes like cold apples and everyone seems a bit more inclined to say morning to strangers. I arrived at St. Jude's sixth form with a spring in my step that was dangerously close to a hop. I saw him before he saw me. He was standing by the lockers, his back straight, his expression schooled into that familiar mask of frosty indifference. A group of Year 12s scurried past him like he was a particularly intimidating statue. To the rest of the school, he was still Thorne the unapproachable, the boy who breathed equations and spoke in footnotes. But I saw the way his hand hovered over his satchel. I saw the way he glanced toward the entrance every time the double doors swung open. "Morning, partner," I chirped, sliding into the space beside him. I might have accidentally bumped his shoulder a bit too hard, causing him to stumble slightly. Alistair steadied himself. He looked down at me, and for a second, the frost remained. Then, slowly, the corners of his mouth twitched. It wasn't a full smile. Alistair didn't do things by halves. He did them by increments, but it was there. "You're late, Miller. 3 minutes and 12 seconds. I was busy contemplating the existential dread of my cereal bowl. I lied. "Did you read it?" He didn't have to ask what it was. He reached into his blazer pocket and pulled out the piece of paper. It was no longer crumpled. It had been carefully ironed out, the edges straight and crisp. "Your grasp of iambic pentameter is non-existent," he said, his voice low, "and your use of the word spherical is biologically inaccurate." My heart sank a little. "Oh, right, sorry. I'll go back to the drawing board. Maybe I'll use oblong next time." However, he continued, cutting me off. The sentiment was noted and, strictly speaking, appreciated. He handed the paper back to me, but as I reached for it, he didn't let go immediately. Our fingers brushed, and I felt that same hum of electricity I'd felt in his kitchen. "I especially liked the bit about the buses," he added, his voice barely a whisper. "I'd never considered their inner lives before. I suspect the number 14 is quite depressed." I let out a laugh that was a bit too loud for the quiet corridor, drawing several confused stares from passing students. I knew it. It's the yellow paint. It's a cry for help. The week that followed was a blur of revision and strange, wonderful moments. We became a fixture in the library, but the silence between us had changed. It wasn't a wall anymore, it was a bridge. He still corrected my maths, and I still drew little doodles of capybara astronauts in the margins of his physics notes, but there was a new rhythm to it. I learned that he liked his tea with exactly 1.5 teaspoons of sugar. He had a special small spoon for the half. He learned that I couldn't study unless I was wearing mismatched socks. I found out that he secretly enjoyed terrible 80s synth pop, but felt it was mathematically inferior to classical music. I told him that I believed the universe was held together not by gravity, but by the collective willpower of people trying to find their car keys. That's statistically impossible, he'd say, but he'd be smiling when he said it. I was a nervous wreck. I had managed to spill coffee on my white blouse 10 minutes before we were due to start, resulting in a brown stain that looked suspiciously like a map of Australia. My hair was doing that thing where it defied the laws of physics, and I'd forgotten my index cards in my locker. I can't do it, Alistair, I hissed as we stood at the front of the classroom. I'm going to trip. I'm going to forget how to speak English, and Mrs. Higgins is going to turn me into a footstool. Alistair looked at me. He looked at the Australia shape stain on my chest. He looked at my wild hair. Then he did something that silenced the entire room. He reached out and tucked a stray lock of hair behind my ear. Miller, he said, his voice steady and calm. Logic dictates that you are the most prepared person in this room. You have spent 3 weeks talking to a cat about romantic poetry. You have survived my company for over a month, a 10-minute presentation is nothing. But the stain, I whispered. It's a metaphor, he said, without missing a beat, for the imperfection of the human experience, very Keatsian. I blinked. You're making that up. Completely. Now, shall we? The class actually laughed, not at us, but with us. Even Mrs. Higgins cracked a microscopic smile. As we reached the conclusion, I felt a surge of confidence. I looked at Alistair, and he nodded at me, giving me the floor for the final line. So, I said, leaning against the teacher's desk and miraculously not knocking it over. Keats told us that beauty is truth beauty, and I think what he meant was that we shouldn't be afraid of the messy bits, the stains, the mistakes. The tiny hats on cats, because that's where the truth is. It's in the things that don't quite fit into the box. The silence that followed was different from the silence Alistair used to carry. It was warm. Then the room erupted into applause. As we walked back to our desks, Alistair leaned in close, a bit theatrical. Miller, but not entirely inaccurate. Admission of defeat, I grinned. An acknowledgement of a valid hypothesis, he countered. The term began to wind down, and the looming shadow of exams started to fade, replaced by the giddy anticipation of the summer holidays. On the final day of term, we met by the old oak tree at the edge of the school playing fields. The air was heavy with the scent of mown grass and the distant sound of someone playing a radio in the car park. Alistair was leaning against the trunk, looking uncharacteristically relaxed. He'd ditched his blazer, and his sleeves were rolled up. I have something for you, he said as I approached. Is it a dictionary? Because I know I still spell occurrence wrong. Better, he handed me a small, wrapped box. I opened it carefully. Inside, resting on a bed of tissue paper, was a small, hand-carved wooden cat. It was tiny, no bigger than a 5 OP piece, but the detail was incredible. It had a little notched ear and a tail that curled around its paws, and on its head, carved with painstaking precision, was a tiny top hat. I felt a lump form in my throat. Alistair, did you make this? He looked away, his cheeks flushing a faint pink. My grandfather taught me woodturning when I was younger. It's a hobby I don't usually share. It's not very logical. It's the most logical thing I've ever seen, I whispered, holding the little cat in my palm like it was made of gold. It's perfect. It's perfectly imperfect. I thought you might say that. We stood there for a long time, watching the sun begin its slow descent toward the horizon. The sky was turning a soft, bruised purple, the color of an old plum. So I said, breaking the silence, "What happens now? We've finished the project. The box is officially broken. Do you go back to being the cold genius of St. Jude's? And I go back to being the girl who gets her head stuck in railings?" Alistair turned to face me. The golden light of the setting sun caught his eyes, making them look less like cold marbles and more like polished amber. "I think," he said, "that the cold genius has retired. He was a bit of a bore. Anyway, he didn't know anything about the inner lives of buses or the importance of biscuits. And the girl who gets her head stuck in railings? I think she should stay exactly as she is," he said softly. "But perhaps she might consider having someone nearby to help pull her out of the railings, or to join her inside them if the view is good." I felt a tear prick at the corner of my eye, but I brushed it away with a laugh. "The view is excellent, Alistair. You can see the whole world from here if you just tilt your head the right way." "Then I suppose I'll have to practice tilting my head." He reached out and took my hand. His grip was firm, warm, and utterly certain. It wasn't a grand, cinematic gesture, but it felt more significant than any poem or equation. It was a promise. A promise that the music we'd found wouldn't end with the school term. As we walked toward the school gates for the last time that year, I thought about all the things I'd learned. I'd learned that you can't judge a book by its cover, but you also can't judge a boy by his bookshelf. I'd learned that silence can be a conversation, and that a tiny felt hat can change the course of a life. But mostly, I'd learned that the world is a much bigger, much stranger, and much more beautiful place when you stop trying to fit everything into a box. Life is messy, it's loud, it's confusing, and it occasionally smells like lemon perfume and wet cat. It's full of mistakes that turn into masterpieces and strangers who turn into the people you can't imagine living without. And as the streetlights began to flicker on, casting long, hopeful shadows across our path, I knew that this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the end of the introduction. I looked at Alistair, who was currently trying to explain why the physics of a swing set were fascinating while simultaneously nearly tripping over a loose paving stone. "Careful, Thorne," I laughed, squeezing his hand. "You're starting to act like me." "Perish the thought," he replied, but he didn't let go, though I suppose, if I must be clumsy, there's no one else I'd rather fall with. And under the vast, twinkling canopy of the London sky, we kept walking, to mismatched melodies finally finding their tune, ready to write the next verse together. I reached into my pocket, felt the wooden cat with the tiny hat, and smiled. The universe was definitely held together by willpower and car keys. But mostly, I suspected, it was held together by the people who were brave enough to be a little bit ridiculous. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't worried about the next step, because whatever happened, I knew it would be brilliant, it would be daft, it would be us.